South Africa has slipped to almost last place in the Global Digital Competitiveness rankings. This is in terms of readiness to adopt digital technologies for economic transformation in business, government and society. So in 2019, we were ranked 48th out of 60 countries, but this year we slipped to number 63 out of 64. Ari Katz is the CEO of Boston Online High School. He joins us now to unpack some of his insights relating to this big drop in the country's rankings. Ari, it's great to have you with us on the program. Thanks very much for coming on. And I think perhaps as a start, break it down for us in layman's terms. What does this ranking actually mean? It's quite a mouthful. Global Digital Competitiveness Ranking.
So what the IMD survey actually does is it ranks the countries in terms of their ability to adapt to transformation and to digital technologies in incorporating that into economic growth. And the reason that that's so important for us in South Africa is that we all know that technology is a disruptor of almost every single industry that we operate in. And related to that is the fact that if you look at the survey, you will see that those countries that performed well have extremely low unemployment rates, whereas those countries like South Africa that performed poorly have extremely high unemployment rates.
Sure.
So it's important for us as an economy and as a society to address the digital transformation so that we ultimately can address our ability for employment.
Yeah. I mean, can we make the connection that our unemployment rate is closely linked to our inability to adapt in this way?
Yeah, definitely. There's definitely a direct correlation. The truth is that the world has moved towards a knowledge-based economy. And we in South Africa, in fact, in the category of knowledge, within that survey, we performed very poorly. So in areas such as education achievement, research and development, high-tech, we performed extremely poorly, which talks to the fact that we do not have a knowledge-based economy.
Can you give us a comparison of just to give us some context around our own performance? A country that is comparable to our own in some of the challenges that we face in South Africa. Is there such a country on this list that performed a lot better?
So the reality is that the countries that would be comparable to South Africa all performed poorly. That's the reality. And the way we have to fix that is that the only area that we actually performed well was the area in spending. In fact, we're spending a huge amount of money on education. We spend 6% of our GDP on education, but we have very poor results. And that talks to the fact that if you look at, for example, in 2020, 38% of matriculants wrote mathematics. In fact, only 20-something% of matriculants in 2020 were able to get 30% for mathematics. Now, if we're in that space, there is no way that we are going to be able to compete in a new world which is based on knowledge-based economies. And so I think what's very important is for us to, quite frankly, to wake up and smell the coffee, actually, to find out that we need to adapt and implement a system which is based on critical thinking. We need an education system where we're going to create innovators and not necessarily people who are just looking for jobs, but people who can compete on the world stage, in the world economy. And to this end, one of the things that we're doing is we're implementing the Cambridge-based curriculum where we can compete with 160 countries in the world, and we can develop talent that is going to be critical thinkers and innovators that can compete in the gig economy and can look for employment whilst they live in South Africa, can work on a global scale.
Yeah, so these are changes that you're making as Boston Online High School. It does sound like the kinds of changes we need in our government school system.
Well, the reality is I think we need to move away from rote learning. It's not a question of whether it's government schools or private schools or whatever it is. I think it's about a philosophy. We need to move away from rote learning to a culture of teaching and learning which is based on innovation, critical thinking, and so that we change the way we think about our futures. Our future isn't necessarily about getting a job, because if you look at our high unemployment rate in South Africa, it's almost impossible to solve that problem through employment in itself. We have to solve the problem by becoming part of the global stage, by becoming part of the knowledge-based economy. We have to create inventors. We have to create innovators. We have to create people that can compete on the global scale. And that's why we've taken the view to move towards a Cambridge system, which is a global system, and where we can train talent to compete on a global scale. We have to change the way we think about education and the way we think about our futures.
You touched on this earlier, the fact that South Africa ranks among countries on education spending. It ranks quite highly, in fact, second on education spending. And as we've been discussing this morning, it's not translating into the kinds of outcomes that we ideally want to see in education. So, you talk about these ideas around creating inventors, creating innovators. How do we implement changes now, Ari, that can start us on that road?
Okay, so as I said, I think it starts off philosophically with changing the way in which we do teaching and learning. As I said, it's not about rote learning. It's about critical thinking. It's about analysis, interpretation. We should be making mathematics a subject which is relevant to our daily lives, not something where we learn that these are the points that you plot on a graph, but to understand what the relevance of y equals mx plus c is in our daily lives and how we translate that into everything we do on a daily basis. And that is, again, why we've chosen a methodology which is geared towards that. So if you think of a simple example such as y equals mx plus c, that is not just a whole bunch of points on a straight line, but actually we should say, well, conceptually, how does y equals mx plus c relate to, for example, a taxi ride? And that gives it relevance. And students through the relevance will create a love for teaching and learning.
If I take a look at some of our performance areas on this scale in terms of competitiveness, there are three key areas there. I want to look at future readiness over the years and how we've declined in terms of in terms of the rest of the world. So 2017, we ranked 42nd on this ranking. It went up to 43rd, 44th, and then a big jump between 2019 and 2020 to 57. Now in 2021, sitting at 59. Particularly insofar as this issue of future readiness is concerned, Ari, it's an incredibly worrying trend, the fact that we've gone so much lower in the rankings, especially in a post-pandemic environment where we are so reliant on technology.
So you're 100% right. And in fact, if you break down future readiness, or how that survey addresses future readiness, it effectively talks to three categories. The first one is adaptive attitudes. The second one is business agility, and the third one is IT integration. And all of those together talk about being able to think out the box. And if you think about it, the days of competing with your neighbor who lives in your suburb are gone. Today, we have to compete on a global scale. And moving towards a knowledge-based economy will help us achieve future readiness. We have to train our graduates to be able to compete in the gig economy. It's very interesting that in the pandemic period, there's a company that managed to place 10 million people, just think about that, doing individual little jobs, things like creating a logo or creating a website or whatever it may be. But they were able to place 10 million people during the pandemic because we've moved towards a knowledge-based economy. Now, those 10 million people, if you look at where they were employed, they actually came from right around the world. They were from no one single country. And so the world is our stage if we're able to create graduates who are future ready. And future ready, as you mentioned before, is made up of the three things: adaptability, agility, and integration.
Yeah.
And all of those are about critical thinking. All of those are about thinking out the box.
Yeah. Shall we talk about the issues around technology, Ari? Because there's quite an interesting subcategory when it comes to this issue of technology. There's the regulatory framework and the technological framework. There's capital as well as the third subcategory. But in terms of regulatory framework, is this more in terms of the kinds of policies that we're making in the country?
Absolutely. That's exactly what it's talking about. It's talking about opening up the economy in terms of the regulation. But in addition to the fact, we have to get to a situation where we're able to have access to data. Data in South Africa is far too expensive to allow either for teaching and learning or for business or anything else, for it to be almost freely available. When you talk about international economies that have low unemployment, data in those countries is extremely cheap and in inverted commas, freely available. Now, I'm not suggesting it should be free, but I certainly am suggesting that the price of data should be significantly cheaper. And that talks to all the things you were talking about in terms of regulatory environments, etc. And so we definitely need to address the cost of data if we want to become part of the world stage.
It doesn't leave you with a good feeling, Ari, in terms of specifically when we think of issues like our education system. You talked about the number of maths, shall we call them graduates, at school level, people who are doing well in maths and science, our staggering unemployment numbers. So this competitiveness ranking, it makes you feel like we're in a very tough position, and a lot needs to change for us to move forward, as you say, in the gig economy.
So you're absolutely correct. I mean, there's no point in hiding behind fancy slogans. The reality is the numbers don't lie. When 20% of our matriculants are able to get 30% for mathematics, there is something fundamentally wrong. And we need to it's time for introspection. It's time to have a look at what are we doing wrong philosophically, and then implement that into the system. And as I said, we need to talk about being able to compete on the global stage. We're living in a world which is based on a global economy. It was interesting, the interview just before the sports today spoke about Spot, which was the robot that they're using in the mining industry. Now just think about that. 10 years ago, 20 years ago, who would have thought that in mines you would be using technology? But the technology there is replacing human beings, and which is probably a good thing in terms of creating more safe environments. But actually implementing technology means more jobs. The only difference is they are different jobs, and those jobs require a knowledge-based economy. So if we want to embrace technology, if we want to reduce unemployment, we have to agree to move towards a knowledge-based economy and the global stage.
Certainly very worrying indeed. Ari Katz, let me thank you for your time this morning. He's the CEO of Boston Online High School, and South Africa is slipping to almost last place in the Global Digital Competitiveness rankings, going from not a bad position to some 5 years ago to now second last, 63 out of 64 economies in terms of competitiveness.